Alright, so let's check the agenda. Wait a minute. I just have one question. How are we going to effectively communicate to the audience that we are discussing cinema here with a capital C and not just another movie? Right. Okay, so I'll take the video and in post-production I'll turn down the saturation dial all the way down to serious and important movie gray. Okay. I don't know why I didn't think of that, sir. Let's do this.
Differently.
Welcome back, Disney shills, ladies, gentlemen, to the channel. And I am officially done with my brief hiatus. So we are back and we are going to once again operate, hopefully, at full force. So, as most of you know, the most important film of the year was released just last month. And that is Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which is an adaptation of a novel that many in Hollywood consider to be impossible to adapt for the big screen. David Lynch infamously took a swing in 1984, and it is widely considered to be one of the biggest cinematic disasters in history. So, how did Denis Villeneuve fare, considering he is arguably one of the best and sensational working directors today? For the most part, I would say he did a very good job, because Dune was definitely a movie that I was excited for. And I'm just going to come out and say it. I thought this movie was really, really good, but I did not love it. I will admit up front that I have not read the novel, so I'm not familiar with all of the lore and mythology that goes into this movie, but I was able to take in and understand everything that Denis Villeneuve delivered on screen, and a lot of this world building and mythology that took place in Dune was exposition that didn't necessarily feel like exposition, and I can say that that is almost always a good thing. So, obviously, the most impressive thing about Dune is both the technical prowess with which it was made and the scale of the movie, which is absolutely massive. I'm not going to get into the whole theater HBO Max debate, because the fact is, if you've watched Dune, then you've watched Dune. Is it a different experience in a theater? Sure. But I wouldn't necessarily say one is better than the other. Whatever you take away from the movie, I think that is what's important here. And when I walked away from Dune, I came away thinking that I really enjoyed the movie, but I felt like I wasn't nearly as enraptured as I should have been. Denis Villeneuve and the crew did a fantastic job bringing the world of Dune to life and presenting it to us in such an engaging way. And again, the scale of this movie is so impressive and breathtaking at times that it is hard not to get swept up in the spectacle of it all. But underneath all of the technical brilliance of Dune is a story that does in fact feel like half of a story. And this has been part of the wider discussion surrounding Dune ever since its release. This movie definitely feels like half of a movie. And I think my biggest issue with the fact that this is only half of a movie is the movie chose to end on a very strange note when it had about 2 or 3 other more natural and, quite frankly, more impactful opportunities for an ending throughout the movie, but it chose to end on the note that it did, and quite frankly, it didn't necessarily work for me. You leave it on a strange cliffhanger. Weird choice. But I will say this in defense of Dune, and that is that I really, really enjoyed this movie because, you know, it was made with such skill and technical brilliance that I was able to engage with the story despite not being very familiar with it because of everything that was unfolding on the screen. It was happening in such a beautiful and skillful way that I couldn't help but find myself get swept up in the spectacle of it all. And within the spectacle of it all is a movie that really anchors itself with some pretty interesting characters. But on the other hand, you have characters that feel a little bit hollow, and characters that I feel probably got a little bit of the short end of the stick when it comes to development. Timothée Chalamet is very impressive in this movie. I will say that, because I am someone who has not necessarily been his biggest fan. He's a talented actor, don't get me wrong, but I got a little tired of seeing him in every sort of prestige or awards movie that was coming out every single year, and I just had a little bit of Chalamet fatigue set in for me. That said, his performance in Dune was actually pretty captivating, and I think part of the reason it really stood out to me is because he was surrounded by a much more interesting cast, and he still managed to anchor the film with this sense of callowness that he really relies on throughout the majority of this film before Paul really begins what I assume is going to be his true character arc from, you know, what is essentially the traditional hero's journey. But I was very impressed with Timothée Chalamet, and I thought he did a good job. This is a movie that takes itself very seriously, so a lot of the performances lean on this sense of austerity. And for the most part, I would say this tone works, and it works well for the movie as a whole, but there are moments where it seems like the story needs a little bit more life or a little bit more levity to it. And I would say that is one of my biggest issues with Dune, is that it very much feels self-indulgent at times. But this self-indulgence is also part of the reason that it sort of excels. So it's kind of a weird situation that I find myself in with this movie. And in terms of the rest of the cast, I thought they all did a pretty fantastic job. Oscar Isaac did a really good job with his character, considering he had really only a role for this particular movie. And I think that the role that Oscar Isaac was in, it would have been all too easy for him to play this with a sense of, you know, repressed rage, and he didn't do that. He brought more nuance to the character and kind of gave him this sense of, really almost this sense of repressed melancholy. And I thought that was an interesting take for the character, because the archetype that Duke Atreides is very much the kind of character that does lend itself to being angry and power-hungry, and that was simply not the case here, and I appreciated that. Perhaps the most interesting character, and in my opinion the best performance in this movie, came from Rebecca Ferguson as Jessica, who is Paul's mother. Which, by the way, I love that in this huge science fiction space opera, you just have a character named Jessica. So, Rebecca Ferguson was the best thing about this movie. She is absolutely unstoppable, bringing a presence of both ambiguity yet ferocity to the role of Jessica, and I loved every single minute of her performance, and I was glued to the screen every time she was in the frame, because the movie made a really wise decision to make her the sort of secondary main character, and she is pretty much vital to the character arc that Paul not only goes through in this movie, but I imagine his character arc that will unfold in Dune Part 2, which is officially happening. And I'm glad to say that that's the case, because I think the biggest thing that I took away from Dune is I liked enough of it, and I found myself invested in the characters, specifically of Paul and Jessica, enough to want to see how the rest of the story unfolds. But I also would just like to see Villeneuve and the rest of the artists involved with this project be able to see this vision through, because it's very apparent that a lot of hard work was put into this movie, and I think it is a really beautiful blend of live-action characters and really top-of-the-line CGI work. Now, as I said, I don't think that I was nearly as captivated by Dune and its world as I should have been, considering it has been the best-selling science fiction novel for a very long time. But the thing is, when this movie works, it kind of sings, and that's the beautiful thing about it, is I found myself really being invested in the parts that worked for me, and the parts that didn't work for me, you know, it was still easy for me to sort of not overlook them, but to recognize that just because the movie has some things that don't work for me doesn't take away from all of the things that it does extremely well. And it does do a lot of things extremely well. One of which being the fact that this world somehow feels extremely palpable. It feels very real and visceral, despite it clearly being fictional. And I think a lot of this has to do with the characters, and it's not just the main cast of Oscar Isaac, Rebecca Ferguson, and Timothée Chalamet. It is very much all of these supporting characters that come into play. You know, whether it be Josh Brolin's character, or Dave Bautista's character, or Jason Momoa's character, who I think Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho, this is perhaps my favorite performance of his. This is the best I've ever seen him act, and I thought he was really charismatic when he was on screen. He had the most heartfelt moment of this movie. The most emotional scene of this movie comes from Jason Momoa, and it is largely because of the relationship that he has with Timothée Chalamet's Paul, because the movie takes its time to develop that relationship and show us how much those two mean to each other. And that sort of brings me back to the tone of seriousness and self-importance that Dune has, and part of it is definitely, I think that a lot of blockbusters in the past decade going into 2021 and also 2020 is we're getting a lot of movies that take themselves very seriously, and sometimes I think this comes at the cost of emotion between the characters and also allowing the audience to form an emotional connection with the characters. And that is also one of the criticisms I have with Dune, is it is a movie that can feel very cold at times. And it also adopts the same ugly, washed out, desaturated color palette that every single action blockbuster wants when they try to be minimalistic and gritty. And I'm just really tired of seeing this aesthetic, and I understand that the movie largely takes place on a desert planet, so a monochromatic look makes sense in a lot of ways. But I do think there were definitely opportunities in this movie to give this movie a little bit more vibrance. And, you know, this is a personal criticism for me. This is something that I dislike seeing in every movie. This is not exclusive to Dune. So there are also, a lot of characters that feel really half-baked. The villain of the movie, Baron Harkonnen, is obviously severely underdeveloped, but a lot of this could be chalked up to the fact that this is only part one of a much more expansive story. I do think Stellan Skarsgård was intimidating enough as Baron Harkonnen, but he wasn't really given a whole lot to work with, and as of right now, he kind of just seems like a standard mustache twirler. I wasn't very scared of him, or fully understanding of his motivations as a character. But I will say this, I do think that as a presence, he came across pretty impressive on the big screen, in the sense that I think the translation from, at least people that I know that have read Dune, the translation from the book to the big screen of Baron Harkonnen was actually quite impressive, and one of the, really accurate things that this movie does, which it does a lot of. A lot of the book is in this movie, but they cut what was apparently one of the most important character arcs, and I definitely understand why, because within the context of the movie, there is something that happens with the doctor that belongs to House Atreides, where he, spoiler alert for the people that still care about spoilers in 2021 for some unbeknownst reason, he betrays Duke Atreides and allows Baron Harkonnen to sort of launch an attack against House Atreides, and we're not really given any understanding of why the Doctor chose to do this other than a really throwaway and fleeting mention of his wife. So it definitely feels like his character was not only underdeveloped, but it also made the following action scene that took place after his betrayal feel really weightless, because it didn't really feel like there were any stakes, because there wasn't any genuine build-up to it. So there are definitely some issues with this movie going on that I think primarily happened because they did have to make this a part one and somehow condense such a epic and massive book into a 2.5-hour movie. And I think the story and certain characters suffer from it at certain parts. But for the most part, I do think Dune has massive potential. And because Denis Villeneuve is such a talented director, you could make the argument that he is the best working director right now, and I wouldn't disagree with you. So because he is such a talented director, and because this movie was so successful, not only in attracting fans of the book, but also bringing in new fans who have never read Dune, who haven't watched the 1984 David Lynch version, and in terms of its box office gross, because Dune was so successful in doing all of these things, I do think that this movie and Denis Villeneuve, by extension, have the potential to launch the next mega franchise in Hollywood. Something akin to The Lord of the Rings. Now, that is a very high bar to clear, I understand that. Personally, I think The Lord of the Rings is the best trilogy in cinematic history, but I do think Dune has that potential, because to me it has a lot more substance and weight to it than something like Star Wars. And another thing that I found really interesting about Dune was that it is such a razor-sharp and clinical depiction of post-9/11 policy. And I never really thought that I would see that in a science fiction space opera. But it is executed very, very well. And Whether or not that's what you take away from the movie, I don't think it necessarily matters. But it's hard to ignore the parallels, and it's hard to ignore that it definitely feels like the movie is commenting on a post 9/11 society. But I think it does it extremely well. And again, the cinematography in this movie is absolutely breathtaking. And it should go without saying that Denis Villeneuve's directorial skills are nothing short of incredible. He does a great job with this movie, and I think this is just a really impressive movie to just watch, to behold all of the visuals and, immerse yourself in the experience of Dune. Even if the story doesn't fully develop itself, even if there are characters that feel like they should have been a lot more important than they actually were, I think there is something for everyone to take away from Dune. Even if the entire movie doesn't work for you, I cannot imagine that somebody walks away from this movie hating it, because I think there is that much to this movie. Do I think it's this grand, big, artistic statement that the marketing and the studio and Villeneuve himself would want us to believe? To some degree, yeah, because it is kind of a bold swing for a blockbuster to take, especially in 2021. But I also don't think that its overinflated sense of self-importance lends itself to being immune from criticism, because it is definitely not a perfect movie, and I've made that very clear. And this is coming from someone who really liked the movie, and someone who really likes when directors are able to fully express their style and vision, and that is definitely what happened in Dune. So I am going to recommend Dune to everyone. I think it is well worth your time and absolutely worth a watch. How you watch it, I do not care. Watch it in the theater if you feel safe, or watch it at home on HBO Max if that's what you prefer. I really don't think it matters. But I would just say, try to go into it with an open mind, because as someone who's not typically a science fiction fan, that was always the biggest hang-up for me when it came to something like Dune. But I am a big fan of Blade Runner 2049, which Denis Villeneuve also directed, and that movie was amazing. And I think he succeeds with adapting Dune, something that many, many people thought was a near impossible task to do. So I recommend Dune to everyone, and if you do watch it, let me know what you think. Let me know what your thoughts are. Do you hate it? Do you love it? And feel free to tell me how wrong I am. Feel free to tell me that it is a perfect blockbuster and it is cinema with a capital C, because that's just the world we live in right now. And, yeah. So the channel's back, everybody. So thank you for watching. I hope that you're all doing well, staying safe, and staying healthy. Otherwise, good night. I will see you next time, and may your heart be your guiding key.